So welcome, Gregor Maehle, to Keen on Yoga Chats.
Thanks for having me, Adam. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you again. And today we're going to talk about Gregor's book, particularly finding, I think, is it Finding Your Divine Purpose? Or something
Yeah,
along those lines, isn't it?
find your life's divine purpose. How to find your life's
Divine
divine
Purpose.
purpose.
How to write. Okay, so the book and also aspects of devote. Although we're very kind of skeptical these days to talk about devotion, or they're very unpopular, these words, devotion, sacrifice. How to also kind of look towards these notions within practice towards facilitating, a deeper delve into ourselves, as it were. So, they're definitely there. There's a lot of bhakti involved in the yoga tradition, but yet, how does that relate to the practice that we're doing? And how also, I'd be interested to know your notions, Gregor, as to how bhakti might relate to even modern postural yoga, how if you can find any kind of linkage there. Anyway.
Oh, heaps. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay.
So, the most important aspect of bhakti is what are you devoted to? Yeah. Of course, if we ask somebody to devote themselves to a concept of the divine, which even if they make best efforts, ultimately it alienates them. Yeah. And for me personally, any aspect of the divine that is anthropomorphic, that is having human characteristics, I find totally alienating. I can't commit to that. And that is simply because I think for let's just say, for somebody who has a slightly intellectual, psychological, philosophical connotation, orientation, it's absolutely clear that an anthropomorphic divine, one that has human characteristics, is nothing but an extrapolation of a human psyche into the sky. Yeah. So in other words, you're hoping that there's a big papa or a big mama that fixes your problems, and obviously, if you look at the entire universe, now since we have science and we know about galaxies and black holes and we know about relativity and quantum mechanics, you just can't get anymore to that the divine is a human being. That's just, there is an offensiveness in it, and the offensiveness comes from speciesism.
Yes, speciesism.
And so speciesism. And so speciesism is the belief that our species somehow is better, superior. Why wouldn't it be a deer or a microbe, or a whale? Why would it be a human being? And, if we don't manage to blow up...
it's ironic as well.
Yeah. And if we don't manage to blow up this planet and hopefully life continues on, there will be more advanced species than us. Why wouldn't it be one of them who is the divine? Why a human being? It's so obviously a minute point in the history of life. It can't be a human being.
It's funny, because actually Krishna says in the Gita, doesn't he? Well, it's easy to worship me with form. He says, you can work. I think I can't remember the chapter exactly, but he said, but those can worship without form, but it's actually easier with name and form to grasp my essence, right? I mean,
yes.
And, definitely if we look at the main text that we often refer to when we're talking about bhakti and we're talking about the Gita, and in there there's definitely as we were talking before we started, an anthropomorphized, albeit in an exotic form, with Krishna there as as the charioteer this time, we're encouraged, and Arjuna is very much encouraged to have a personal relationship with this individual.
Now, and I think that's totally fine if we do that, but we need to know that anthropomorphic representation of the divine is nothing but an icon, a placeholder. Yeah. So let's say if you have an icon in your applications folder, on your computer, and you sort of go get info, you see that the icon is maybe, let's say, 35 kilobyte. It's nothing. Whereas the application that you open may have 2 gigabyte. Yeah. So there is a difference between the icon that you click on and the application that opens. And the application is to the magnitude of 1,000,000 bigger than the icon. The icon doesn't actually do anything. Yeah. So similarly, you to choose a representation of the divine just means an icon that I click on to access the divine. I must know that that is not the divine. Because if I don't know that, then automatically who doesn't worship exactly the same icon, in my eyes, will be a pagan or an infidel. Yeah? So, because we live now in a global village, if I practice a form of devotion, bhakti, it must automatically allow me to develop a curiosity to which forms of worship of other people. Yeah. And so this is given if I realize that we all worship the same divine, we just access it through different icons. Yeah. So I also use anthropomorphic representations of the divine, but I always tell myself, remember, this is not the true divine. It's just, for me, an access gate, you know?
And even the teaching, I mean, it's often said, take the guru, the teacher, as a representative of the divine as well, right? I mean, how does it look, I mean, just kind of speeding on, how does that look in terms of practice, in terms of relating one's own physical practice even to some aspect of devotion running through it? Okay.
Look, I mean, practically speaking, I never do my asana practice without having a divine image standing in front of me, Maybe if I was practicing in a group, I wouldn't do that because I would feel a bit coy, It's like I have some quite bizarre looking Hindu images. So maybe I wouldn't do it if I was practicing in a yoga shala. But apart from that, I always have them in front of me. Yeah. And it always reminds me, the reason why I'm doing my practice is because, I want to, surrender to the divine, offer myself as a conduit, as a canal to the divine, for the divine. That's why I'm doing my practice. I find it particularly important when I do pranayama and meditation practice. Yeah, but also in my asana practice, I have it always there. When I do breath retentions, I will always actually do trataka on the divine image. Yeah, and that sort of, since I do that, I stay in a sattvic state. Yeah, so I never go into this dull tamasic state in my kumbhakas, since I do actually trataka on a divine image. Nevertheless, I always tell myself, this is just the placeholder, what I'm looking at. This is not the true divine. I just use that because of it's too difficult for me to keep sight of what the divine really is.
How does that relate to devotion in terms of bhakti or this idea of love? I mean, because it's easy to sidestep the whole issue and say, well, when Krishna says devote to me, focus on me, that we can call that one pointed attention, can't we? We can call that ekagrata and kind of sidestep the whole issue of giving ourselves away and the kind of and the kind of aspects of devotion that we may be uncomfortable with through Western theology and past history, right? I mean, does it just mean concentration when we're saying devotion, or are we talking about something else that's coming from?
Yes, so I think that there is a very, very important surrender aspect. Like, for example, when we look at the Yoga Sutra, Ishvara Pranidhana, that is surrendering to the divine. Yeah, but what it means really is that at some point in my meditation, I'm actually trying to figure out what it is that the divine wants me to do. Yeah. For example, in the Gita, it's quite obvious that Krishna wants Arjuna to fight to restore dharma in the world, that is righteousness, right action, because he's in a situation where, let's say, dark forces are trying to take over the world. So he needs to step up and stand up for dharma, that is right action. Yeah. So that's a typical scenario in what the divine would want us to do. Yeah. But for each individual, see, the way how I see it, and I've written that in my book about the Monte Carlo generator, each individual, each being is, let's say, a permutation, a path of the divine. Yeah. So the reason why each individual being is here, and that is from the greatest genius to the most insignificant a protozoa, like a single cell organism, yeah, microbe. I mean, each one is representing an aspect of the divine, yeah, and so the more conscious or expanded a being becomes, the more you can tune in and co-create with the divine that aspect of the divine that you are here to express, yeah. So for me, I mean, I'm practicing that for a while now. I'm practicing yoga sort of almost half a century now. What would you have me do becomes more and more important. You know?
Yeah.
Like, I have a formal practice early in the morning where I start. Okay, I dedicate this day to you. Yeah. What do you actually want me to do? And, you know, while this sounds funny, it makes the day so much more thrilling. Yeah. There is a passage in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavata Purana, where Krishna says, there is no greater thrill for me to see the devotee realizing me. I cannot but rush to that point to embrace the devotee. So the thing is, the most interesting a very interesting aspect of the divine is that it is cosmic intelligence. Yeah. So the way how I look at the divine, I don't want to emphasize that too much, but you could imagine that it would be a super intelligent software onto which the entire universe is written, yeah, and it uses the sum total of parallel universes as its hardware. All matter, it uses all matter as its hardware. Now, it doesn't work. This metaphor goes only up to a particular point, because the divine is also self-aware and self-conscious, yeah, yeah, and it is capable of imparting instruction. Yeah, so, you know, when you see people who are really inspired, like, for example, the Gita, or when you look at the Bible, or when you look at people like Albert Einstein or Nelson Mandela or, you know, Mozart, you realize that there was a moment in their life when they just opened themselves to something much, much greater than themselves, and where this power came down. That's the point that I'm interested in, you know? And so you can sort of realize when you really open yourself, yeah, you sort of feel that your hair starts to stand. Yeah, there is sort of a certain electricity.
I was going to say, how do you frame it? The opening. I mean, you know, when you say to open yourself, and the rest of the day to you know, to kind of be a conduit and receive. I mean, yeah, how does that actually happen, right? Getting out of the way, as it were.
You mean how does one get there?
Yeah,
well,
like,
you know,
what's it feel like? I mean, also because in your
yeah, well, okay. So how it feels is there is a moment of I would call it being in the zone. Yeah, and it's often described as being in the zone is a terminology used by often musicians or sports people. Yeah. And, I have a friend who used to be a American football player. Yeah. And he had this moment when his team was way back and way down. And then suddenly he realized that something was entering him, and he could see into the future. He knew where the ball would be, and he ran, and he basically scored one goal after another. And after the game, and won the game for his team. And after the game, the big teams were lining up and trying to contract him, but he couldn't play anymore because he was so shocked by that experience. He was a materialistic person up to that. But in that moment, he realized that God had used him to play American football. Yeah. And he was like, how can that be? Yeah. And so he went then on a lifelong spiritual search, and eventually wound up as a Sufi sheikh. Yeah. And so, that sort of really knocked him out of his career. He was this big, bulky American guy, and now he is like devotional Sufi chanting and etc. So,
also, I think it's also nice to reiterate the point that the point is not the action itself; it's the attitude towards the action, right? So, the American football, doesn't really matter inherently necessarily as it, in terms of a purposeful thing in life, but it's his relation to God within whatever he's doing, which I think kind of iterates the dharmic aspects of the Gita. Well, it doesn't really matter what your dharma is, even if it's as Arjuna's is to kill people. The point is that relation with God through whatever you're doing, whatever action it is that you're engaged with, whenever you find yourself doing.
Yeah.